Let's dive right into it. Are we eating our young?
Yes. So it's been nice. It's been nice seeing all of you. No, no. You know, I love that. I did not come up with the title, and but I love it. In fact, I might ask William Morrow about changing the title of the paperback to "Are We Eating Our Young?" because it's a great title. Because yeah, you know, it's been fascinating in the last week. You know, I guess all of you have seen President Biden announcing this student loan forgiveness, and it's really accelerated. Yeah. I liked it. It's really accelerated this conversation that we've been starting to have, and we should have probably started sooner, and now it's picking up, which maybe isn't "Are we eating our young?" but it is kind of what are we doing with college? Because there's a couple things, and they're kind of related to each other. One is, and I mean, really the reason I wrote the book, I mean, I came at it from the perspective of somebody who's been a political writer for 40 years, because, you know, it was fascinating to me to watch college become the fault line in American politics, and the fact that every election, more and more, you see that whether or not you have a college degree seems to determine how you vote. You know, seeing the Democrats become more and more the party of people with college degrees, the Republicans, repositioning themselves as the party of working class people who don't have diplomas, and so I wanted to find out what was going on with that, but clearly. People in America are more and more thinking that kind of our way of college and higher education is broken. You know, I mean, you're seeing it in terms of there's really been a noticeable decline in college enrollment in the last couple of years. I think it's dropped 9% since the start of the pandemic. The surveys they do, you know, higher education and college used to be, for many years, was one of the most trusted institutions in this country, and in the last just few years, trust in college, or its approval rating, I guess you'd call it, has dropped about 19%. And so people want to have this conversation about what is college for, and who should pay for it? Is it society's responsibility, or is it the responsibility of the individual? And because people are starting to ask, you know, are our young being eaten up by this system?
And I thought it was really interesting having the conversation around the student loan forgiveness, the way that, what you mentioned in your book, the way we talk about college students and people with college educations and how that's changed over the years since the GI Bill, and the sort of the effort that's been put into creating this idea of, like, these beatniks are coming and they're going to transform our lives by setting buildings on fire and so forth. And so how did that start? I don't spoil the entire book, but you have given a lot of thought and research into how did going to college go from being this, here's a thing we're going to all do as a society as a nice gift to people coming back from World War II, to I'm not so sure about that, fella.
Yeah, well, you know, one thing, and I think this comes across in the book, and I've even thought about it, I think, more since I finished writing the book, is, you know, so I'm a baby boomer, right? So I went to college from 1977 to 1981, and that was really kind of the tail end of what in the book I kind of call the golden age of college, which is late 40s, 50s, 60s. I'm talking about the time when if you could go to a great state university like Michigan or UCLA or somewhere like that for a few $100s a year, you know. Well, tuition at the University of California was actually free up until the mid 1970s. You know, college. Once more and more people started going to college after World War II, you know, because of prosperity, because of the opportunities that were available, the atmosphere, you know, the vibe around college was hope. It was hopeful. People were excited because it was a possibility to do better than your parents' generation. You know, maybe your dad had worked in a factory, and now you had an opportunity to get an education, and instead of working in a factory or on a farm, you could work with your mind, you could do something more creative, and it wasn't that difficult to go to college. It wasn't as expensive. It wasn't as hard to get in. You know, the admission rate at schools wasn't 6%, you know. It was exciting. I remember being a high school senior in the mid-'70s, and we would go out on Friday nights and talk about what college we might get into, and it was just very exciting, you know. And then, you know, flash forward to the 2010s, and now I'm a parent, and I have two kids in high school at that time, and they're getting ready to go to college. And really, and I think a lot of people in the audience, I think, can probably relate to this, is I think the prevailing attitude around higher education nowadays is fear. That people, in several ways, you know, I mean, the biggest fear is, how am I ever going to pay for this? You know, I think it's kind of cool that I'm doing this program with you, Alexandra, as a moderator, because you're a new parent, right? You just had your first child, and you know, not to turn the tables on you or anything, but I can imagine, like, you know, after the initial wave of excitement, you probably start thinking, all right, now how am I going to, like, pay for my child to go to college? You know, it's like you start thinking about that from day one, you know, but also, you know, a lot of middle-class families, there's this enormous pressure that they feel like their kid has to go to the right college, or else that they're not going to get ahead in life if they don't go to the perfect school, you know, if they don't get into the best possible college. So there's that, and the thing about college, and this is an important part of the book, and I try to explain it, is like you're not going to solve these problems that we have around higher education unless you address the fact that most people don't go to college, or half of people don't go to college, or nearly half. Only 37% of adults right now are people who've completed their bachelor's degree and have a 4-year degree. So, you know, what about the other 63%? And their fear is different, but their fear is that because they didn't go to college, because we've established this system that's kind of a meritocracy, in which the merit is whether or not you go to college and get a degree. And so if you're somebody who doesn't go to college, you will choose not to go to college, or you can't afford to go to college, people are worried or are fearful that people think that they're less worthy, that they're, you know, that they lack merit, that they have less self-worth. So all of those bad vibes have been surrounded with higher education, and it's because we privatized the system, you know, that we haven't made it into we've gotten away from the idea that higher education is a public good that society is responsible for.
There's two things that came up in that I thought were really interesting in the book, where you talk about meritocracy. And apparently the first time the term meritocracy was used, it was sort of with an irony. It's like, this is a made-up word because we're not sure about this concept.
It was satire. It was something that you would have written, right? Yeah, I know. Yeah, yeah.
But it's gone to being this thing that people think very seriously.
Right, and the people adopted it as, yes, this is great, a meritocracy, and you know, it's an understandable idea, right? You know, that everybody's got the opportunity to go to college and get an education, and you're going to rise on your own merit if you work hard and study and do all the right things. Then we know you're going to get ahead, but. The reality is, it doesn't work that way. I mean, for a couple reasons. One is, I mean, you know, I hate to use this word, but the meritocracy is kind of rigged, right? I mean, because if you come from a more affluent family, you know, I mean, look at the SATs. I mean, the SATs were developed to further this idea of a meritocracy. It's like, you know, we're maybe not admitting certain kinds of people, so we're going to give everybody this test. Everybody's going to get a score, and we'll know who the people who have the most merit are because they have the highest score. Well, what's happened, as you all know, over the years is more affluent families spend thousands, or in some cases even tens of thousands of dollars on SAT preparation, on tutors. You know, it's like, well, there's also the essay question. Well, people spend thousands of dollars on essay tutors, you know, and essay preparation. And And the other thing about the rigged meritocracy, as we all know, is these elite colleges that so many people are shooting for give enormous preference to the children of alumni and people, legacy admissions. And so the number of slots that are actually out there for, Joe, working class guy who worked really hard in his high school and in his Rust Belt community and did well, there's just not as many, there's not that many opportunities for those people. So, so the meritocracy fails on that regard. But the other thing, like I said, we don't have a universal college system. We don't have a system where everybody in the country is going to college, and we're probably never going to have that, or at least not in our lifetimes, And so, are you really saying that people who don't go to college are failures in this system? I mean, you shouldn't, but we do tend to do that in this society, and it's important, as I think a lot of you know, because this drives political resentment, and political resentment is what's driving the things we're seeing in the country right now. It's driving Donald Trump, it's driving climate change denial, it drove January 6th. Those things are rooted in resentment, and resentment, I think, is rooted very heavily in how this meritocracy idea went awry.
And I think in terms of the sort of the fears and the idea going awry, you trace sort of through the book the evolution of how people view what the college student is there to do and what the college student is trying to get out of this experience. And so like in like the 1920s or 19-teens, when you've got like 4%, I think you said, of the nation is going to college, you've got like all these people sitting there in their ivory towers drinking gin out of snifters in like a paneled library and not going to class for that reason. And then like eventually people were like, I want to learn things. And so with the GI Bill, people would come in and they would say, well, the civilian students are thinking this professor is ridiculous and knows nothing, but the GIs know they don't know anything, and so they're here to learn. And then you get later on the idea that the student is there to be turned into kind of a product for the employer, and then yes, so can you sort of talk us through that? I'm now.
No, that's a great question. I mean, there's really been this fascinating debate, ever since the dawn of college, probably in America, about what's the purpose of going to college, and you really have these two poles, right? On one pole is, are you going to college to become a better person, to develop a philosophy of life, to become a better citizen, to learn critical thinking, right? Which is so important. And the other pole is, I'm going to college because I want to get a job and make money, basically. I mean, those are the two poles. And the thing is, I had always just inherently sensed that things had changed a lot over the course of my lifetime. And it was interesting researching this book to find out that surveys and statistics have really borne that out. So just backing up, like you said, the attitude after World War II with the GI Bill, which is when you saw a huge surge in enrollment because the government offered this amazing benefit to returning veterans, that they could go to college free, that they got a living stipend, they got their books, everything was paid for. And like you said, these were great students because they, people had thought that working class and middle class Americans weren't college material, and it turned out they were. That they were great students, they wanted to learn, and so that's how the golden age of college really kind of kicked off, right? But what was also happening at that same time was, this was a time in American history, we had just gone through the Great Depression, we'd just gone through World War II, World War I before that. Horrible things that happened in the world in terms of totalitarianism, whether it was fascism or whether it was what Stalin was doing in the Soviet Union. And there was really a faith among thought leaders and educators that education was the way out of these problems. That a better education citizenry would embrace democracy, and would value, would develop moral values and become better citizens. And that was really the zeitgeist, in the 40s and 50s. And what I trace in the book and what's so important and it's fascinating, and you alluded to this earlier in one of your earlier questions, is so what happened is you had this incredibly idealistic generation of young people going to college in the 50s, early 60s, mid 60s, and you think about that time, it was JFK and the Peace Corps and the New Frontier, and it was a very optimistic time, and young people, were feeling good about democracy and these ideas, and then they looked around, and I call it blowback in the book. They saw hypocrisy right here in the U.S. That they. It's like, well, if we're going to embrace the moral values that we're learning about here in college, what's the deal with racial apartheid in the South? Why do we have segregation? And I mean, really, the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins in 1960 that spread across the South really just electrified young people and college students, that they could actually put what they were learning about democracy to use for a cause here at home, and so this flowed into the Berkeley free speech movement, which was a movement for kids to be able to do political stuff on campus, but it was really, a lot of it was motivated by wanting to speak out about civil rights, and that flowed right into the Vietnam War. And again, young people saw hypocrisy and thought that American militarism and imperialism didn't meet the values that they were learning about in their sociology and philosophy classes. And so why this is so important is there was a backlash. The leader of that backlash, you might have heard of him, Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan was a conservative, kind of a long shot underdog candidate who ran for governor of California in 1966, and he seized on what was happening at college campuses, particularly the University of California at Berkeley, as his main issue, that kids were dancing under strobe lights and doing these unthinkable things, and they were becoming communists, and he won in a landslide. And Reagan said Reagan wanted to end free tuition in California, and he said taxpayers shouldn't be studying the intellectual curiosity of young people, which is the 100% polar opposite of that philosophy of liberal education, that became, over time, that's become the philosophy. That's the beginning of the privatization of college education. That's when higher education stopped being a public good and it started being a burden that was to be put on families, that this was like an investment, that all right, if we'll give you, you still have opportunity, obviously millions of people still go to college, we still have lots of college opportunity in this country, but you've got to invest in yourself. You've got to come up with a way, you and your family have to figure out how to pay for this, and we promise you'll make them, it's a good investment, you'll make the money back, and of course the crisis has been that didn't really work out.
And you mentioned a couple of turning points when this could have been different, where in like the 40s, instead of coming up with a grant system, just saying, this could have been, we're going to package this into the welfare that we think people deserve to have, and that didn't happen, and then it made it easier to chip away. Were there other turning points like that when?
Yeah, I think there were several turning points, like you said. I mean, so in the 40s, the GI Bill, there was a lot of excitement about how well this had worked out. Harry Truman was the president. He named a panel. It's kind of lost to history, but education history buffs all know about this. But he started this national panel called the Truman Commission, a blue ribbon commission to study what America should do about higher education. The panel said that higher education should be at least free for the first couple years of college, i.e. community college, basically. But they didn't really come up with any way for the government to directly fund higher education. It's funny because basically, this is a pretty simple concept, right? Because we, for a long time in America, have come to accept the idea that K through 12 education is absolutely a public good. So if you never have children, if your children are grown, you're still paying taxes in your community for the kids of your community to get an education up through grade 12. And obviously, since the middle of the 20th century, getting an education beyond age 12 of some kind, whether it's a classroom college education or whether it's trade school or some kind of advanced learning, is critical for getting ahead now. But we didn't extend that. We didn't extend to make that about, and we could, obviously in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we made other programs like Medicare and Social Security that we made into a public good, but we elected not to do that with college. So that was a huge turning point. And then because we didn't do that, that allowed what happened in the 70s, where you had a new wave of conservative politicians like Reagan, like Nixon, who turned against higher education, and since you hadn't established it as a public good, it made them easy for them to push through policies that made it more privatized, which meant that the government gave the size and influence of Pell Grants, which are the grants that you don't have to pay back. Those started to shrink, and the dependence became more and more on loans that people would have to pay back.
And the irony, as you say, is that just at the time when it became this sort of necessary kind of credential for a lot of the jobs in the economy, was the time when it suddenly wasn't paid for anymore because it had been chipped away at so much by people with an axe to grind against the university for whatever reason. And then also you're having the colleges themselves want money for various exciting things that they'd like to do to attract more people to campus, and then it sort of spirals out of control. Yeah,
it's a weird thing, and I don't think this was necessarily intentional. It was just kind of a perfect storm of bad timing. But going back to that golden age of college in the 60s, so many students majored in the humanities or social sciences. It was really the golden age also of people majoring in English literature or sociology. Philosophy was like a hugely popular major. And when the 70s came, a bunch of things happened all at once. The economy, as we all know, got worse in the 70s, and all of a sudden people realized that, well, if I have an English literature degree or sociology degree, I may not be able to get a job like I would have 10 years ago. And so more and more people started majoring in business or engineering or things like that. And at the same time, like you said, there's this idea, it's called credentialism, basically, that job recruiters, in order to decide who they think are the best candidates for a job, they started deciding, well, the best candidate is somebody who has a college degree, and the better the name of the college, probably the better the applicant. And this became such an important credential. So people desperately needed this diploma to stay in the middle class, to keep to do as good, if not better, than their parents had done. But to get this degree, you couldn't get a degree without spending an enormous amount of money, and for the vast majority of people, that now means borrowing enormous amounts of money. And so people who hadn't been paying attention, all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, where did this $1.7 trillion debt thing come from? Well, that's where it came from. So yeah.
And it's been so frustrating hearing people talk about it as though everyone had the same opportunity to make the same choice to incur this debt in the same way, and some people were responsible about it and they don't have any debt, and other people were irresponsible and have debt. Just the conversation that people are having as though there hasn't been an erosion over time of your ability to go to school without having to bankrupt your future self.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of people choosing to ignore what who really has wealth and who doesn't. One just incredibly important aspect of this whole student loan situation right now is the racial aspect of it, because we have an enormous racial wealth gap in this country. The average white household has 20 times the net worth of the average black household, and where the rubber hits the road is college, right? Because so many young African Americans desperately want to get a college degree and move up in the world and get into the middle class, and that there's literally no family wealth that a typical white family might have to fall back on, and so when you look at when you drill down into the numbers of who has these college loans. The number of loans, but also the size of the loans disproportionately falls on African Americans. It also, I should note, it also falls to some extent disproportionately on women. And remember, we live in a society where women don't have the same earning power still as men after all these years. And so women are, and by the way, also women now attend college at a higher rate than men. I think right now women are up to almost 60% of college enrollment. And so women are borrowing money to get these college degrees, and they're going into the workforce where they're not paid as much as men, and they're expected to pay the money back from these earnings. So there's a lot there's a lot of racial and gender implications to the college debt crisis. That's why people applauded Biden for doing this, because it's important.
And another thing, going back to Ronald Reagan. At the risk of
it's
going
hard.
back
It's hard not to. I wrote a whole book about him too. So. Yeah.
So good. Well, then you're the man to go back to Ronald Reagan with.
Yeah.
I was struck by the fact that he became such an anti-collegiate fellow, because I know one of the things that he always cited as his influence for going into politics was he was sitting there reading the National Review, and of course what catapulted Buckley onto the national stage was he went to Yale and he didn't like it, and he wrote a whole book about how much he'd hated going to Yale, basically, because he thought they weren't indoctrinating him properly, as far as I could tell. I took it to the beach one year, which was a horrible mistake. And so it's such a small book, but it takes so long to read. But
is that God and Man?
God and Man at Yale.
Wow.
His basic thesis was sort of throwing another wrench, sort of one of the cultural war wrenches in, was saying, I think that parents are the consumers, and they're paying to send their children, who are, I guess, not the consumers in this situation, to get a specific product which is to be taught about God and man in the proper way. And instead the university's making them ask all these questions, and the economics department is not teaching economics in the way that I want it taught. And I wonder if that factored into Reagan's thinking, and sort of how much the idea, like, this is a good place to have a big cultural fight, if you see it starting kind of there, or even trace it earlier.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating that, like you said, ever since William F. Buckley went to college in, what was it, the late 40s, early 50s, you've had this idea of conservatives. I mean, academics is a field that has an ethos, right? Ethics that are built around research, built around truth, built around science. It tends to attract more liberal people, and it's always been that way, right? And so this conservative complaint that colleges are places that indoctrinate people to become more liberal, and I don't know if more liberal necessarily, but there are a lot of studies that the college experience is something that creates more tolerance and more understanding. Because not just because of what you learn, although that's a big part of it, but also because of your environment. Colleges are if they're well run, it's a diverse environment. You're meeting people from other parts of the world. You're meeting people from other religions, other backgrounds that if you'd stayed in your hometown, you might not have met. And why the 1960s are so important was because college enrollment exploded in the 1960s, so you had more and more young people going away and getting these experiences and becoming more tolerant or more liberal or whatever you want to call it. And so yeah, if you're William F. Buckley or if you're Ronald Reagan and you're the leader of the conservative movement, it's absolutely oppositional to the values that you're trying to promote. And they found also that Reagan found politically there was a big audience for that. That there were a lot of people a lot of older people who didn't get the opportunity to go to college that these young people were getting, and they were able to gin up this resentment. People don't realize. I mean, there was the reaction and the backlash to some of the student protests in the 1960s. When the Kent State Massacre. I mean, what we know about the Kent State Massacre, basically these National Guardsmen for no reason turned around and fired on a group of students and killed 4 people, wounded 9 people. It was a horrible incident. And when you ask people, they did a poll on the 50th anniversary, which was in 2020, and most people sensibly said the National Guard was to blame for what happened. But in 1970, when it actually happened contemporaneously, 58% of the public blamed the students for what happened.
Except they were like going to the funerals and chanting that they should have studied more.
Kent State 4 should have studied more. The people who died, the funeral, the services for people who died, that they should have studied more. And that was, and there was a great line, this wasn't at Kent State, but it was one of the protests after Kent State, I think at Northwestern or some other school where, just some guy on the street saw these kids protesting and just ran up and started attacking them and said, "You guys are getting the opportunity I never had, and you're all blowing it." And it was a quote. It just summed up the whole resentment politics that would really play out over the next 50 years on this road to Trump and whatever else we're dealing with right now. So.
And the funny thing is, reading this, it also struck me that it's not a new idea, because I was an English and classics major in sort of a complicated manner. But the Aristophanes, one of his plays that I think is funniest and holds up the best, is about a dad who thinks, I gotta send my son to essentially college. Like Strepsiades sends his son Phidippides, who is betting too much money on the horses, and he sends him to learn from Socrates in this thinkery. And basically Phidippides comes back and he's like, I no longer think that what your values are correct, Dad, and I'm gonna use my argument to say that my generation's correct in ways that your generation isn't. And this is from 400 BC. So the idea that I'm gonna send my son to college and he's gonna be ruined apparently has been a potent one and has been with us for a super long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just one of the great moral debates of all time. Is how educated do we need to be, and what is education for? But I think you're right. I mean, I think this fear that parents and families have that they're going to let go of their kids, and send them off to school, send them away, and they're going to come back and not have the same values, or not have the same religion, or not have the same politics. I mean, first of all, it does happen, right? So it's a very real fear, and it's really played out. If you want to talk about what's going on in America right now, the George Floyd protests were such a change moment for this country, and a couple things about that. One, and I think a lot of people don't understand this. I tried to make this point in the book, is that the whole George Floyd, the whole Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protests of 2020, this was a revolution of the college educated. Sociologists who went out and studied who was actually doing these protests were amazed that 80% of the people who were marching at some of these marches had college degrees. So it was not like the long hot summer of the 1960s when cities were erupting and it was working class, black people in the cities. It was, and I think what's happening right now is that people on the right made this connection that, why are all of our young people, taking part in these Black Lives Matter marches? Because you would go to places like Mount Vernon, Ohio, or these conservative towns in middle America, and they were getting hundreds of people for Black Lives Matter marches. And people on the right decided it must be what our young people are being taught, that they're being taught these different values than our values, which is white privilege and white supremacy, apparently, but to some degree. But so what we're seeing, this whole freak out that we're seeing right now, I mean, this is kind of beyond a little bit past the purview of my book, I guess, but because you're seeing it go into K through 12 education, really, this attack on critical race theory, which is really just anti-racism education, but they call it critical race theory, and this freak out about what kids are being taught about race and what they're being taught about the LGBTQ community and what they're being taught about gender, and this whole idea that books have to be removed from libraries. It's all a reaction to this idea that, like you said, that my kid is going to school and he's learning to be different from me, and I don't like it. That's what's happening in America right now.
And I think we have to, if people
we
would
in
like
question
to,
time?
I think
Yeah.
we're in question time. So if people
Cool.
have questions, I think there's microphones on either end and you can proceed towards them in a stately manner.
That'd be great.
And
Hello.
Hi there, quick question.
Yeah.
Part of the title of your book was, How Do We Fix It?
Yeah, that was the hardest part of the book to write. Absolutely. The thing in the book is what I was trying to do was I was trying to explore the problem, and my point was we need to get back to a different mindset. The mindset that we had after World War II. That how can we make college a public good? How can society do more to provide opportunities for our young people? Because right now that's not the mindset. The mindset is the privatized mindset. So to me, in the book, it's not like education department professors debating very specific policies. What I argue is we need to change the mindset to make education, higher education, a public good again. I think this student loan forgiveness. I think this should have just been the first step. That we need to do more because an entire couple generations of young people were basically sold a bill of goods. They were not given the opportunities that baby boomers and other people were given, and they were preyed upon by some of these for-profit universities and other sharks. And so I think student loan forgiveness is part of the solution. And I think when we need to figure out how to pay for opportunities, and we need to make them broader. Our concept needs to be broader. So we need to look at people who aren't going to traditional universities. So we need to have free trade schools. We need to have internships. And I devote a whole chapter in the book to the idea that what would really be a huge change and help turn things around would be universal national civilian service. I think 18-year-olds should have a gap year, and the government should give people opportunities to work in disadvantaged communities, or work on climate projects, because God knows there's a lot of work in that area to be done. Where just like people used to join the military back in the 50s and get drafted, we don't want to go back. We don't want that, but we want people from different backgrounds, people from red states and blue states, and from cities and from small towns in the Rust Belt, to work together on projects that are in the public good. I think it would break some of the cycle that we're now we are losing our young people at age 18. I think this would, instead we're bringing our young people together, we're giving them a chance to work together, and also to maybe focus on their future and how we can provide for a better future for them. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for coming out today. There's this old quote I remember that a society grows great when old men plant trees, the shade under which they will never enjoy. And we right now are in a community or in a society where we have young people that can't afford housing and are declining to have children because they can't afford to have children, and climate change overall. And the phrase eating our young transcends just college. It speaks to all these other things. So my question is, how did we get to this place where we have forgotten that our children are our community rather than in opposition to our community? How did we end up here where college is a wedge issue rather than something that is, you understand what I'm getting at? How did we get here?
Yeah, and you're right. You make a good point. I mean, obviously, for young people, you probably saw the report this week about the the really surprising decline in the national birth rate. And that's a big part of it, right? You know, the fact that not just college debt, although college debt is part of it, but you know, the insane rents that young people are being asked to pay, the fact that we have a dysfunctional political system that hasn't addressed climate change, that can't do anything about gun safety. So all of those things. But again, you know, as I trace in the book, you know, I think it boils down to the haves and the have-nots. You know, that when we privatized college education, that was part of the broader problem of inequality in our society. That you know, privatized education has furthered the unequalness between the very rich at the top and the broad people who you know, are being asked to sustain capitalism by working in jobs that aren't particularly fulfilling. You know, I have to say, I'll admit right now to the biggest, I don't know if I'd call it a mistake, but my biggest regret about the book, which I'm going to actually fix in the paperback edition, hopefully, is you know how after you've spent 2 years doing all this research and the book's finally off to the publisher, and then a week later you find the killer quote that should have been in the book. Well, that happened to me. So I learned after I finished the book that in 1970, right at the peak of the campus protests and everything, this guy whose name was Roger Freeman, who I'd never heard of before, but was actually an advisor to both Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and specializing in like academic related issues. And this Roger Freeman gave an interview to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1970, and he said the quiet part out loud. He said we can't have an educated proletariat. He said that would be dynamite. He said, you know, we have to accept that college just isn't for everybody. That they were terrified of an educated working class and middle class. And the things you've talked about have stemmed from that attitude. And so I think we need to accept that this was deliberate, and you know, and how do we undo this?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
And I think we might be at the end of our time, unless your question is like a yes or no question.
Okay.
First, I have to urge everybody to read Alexandra Petri's column daily in the Post. And I believe this is the most important session and book of this whole festival. You know, what you're addressing here, and you describe it all greatly.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to say my hat says resist, organize, vote. That's how to fix it. But most particularly, you alluded to the inequality, why it is, and so on. It's the money in politics. It's the wealthy people. It's the Koch brothers, ALEC, their organization, you know, funding the MAGA Republicans and all the rest that are basically screwing the planet, all of us, and especially young people and the future generations. So money in politics, getting it out, reversing Citizens United, et cetera. You know, those are the ways to fix it, but can you add to that?
I was gonna add, which is I think, and I think one of the main points I try and make in the book is that higher education and fixing this problem needs to be a front burner issue. It should be up in the top of the issues we're talking about, because right now it's not. And like, for example, I mean, you look at when Biden came in and he had a lot of good ideas that he was pitching, and what was the first idea that they eliminated? It was free community college. That was the first idea that got dropped from his agenda, when maybe that should have been one of the first things that they did, honestly. And you know, I mean, plus it was killed by Joe Manchin, who comes from West Virginia, which if there's any place in the country that could benefit from free community college, it would be West Virginia, right?
And his money comes.
Yeah,
his
and
money
his
and
money,
his power,
and right, and he's somebody.
Money and his power comes from fossil fuels.
Yeah. So I think you're right. I think as voters, we should be asking our elected officials, you know, what are you going to do? Because you know, I mean, Congress can do things. Congress can tax Wall Street, or they can do a wealth tax like Elizabeth Warren has proposed, and that's where the money could come from to give people free college like you had in the 1960s, and we should be doing that. So.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much. And if you want more, read the book. And thank you so much for being here.
This is it. Here it is. So,
After the Ivory Tower
and
Falls.
I'll be 1 o'clock to 2. I'll be signing copies if you guys want to come by. I'm so grateful so many of you came. So I'd love to meet some of you afterwards. So that would be great. Thanks a lot.